So the world recently lost possibly one of the greatest footballers ever, Germany's Franz Beckenbauer, known as the Kaiser or the Emperor for those who would not know what the word Kaiser means. And his passing has not only left a void, and I don't want that to sound like a cliche, but for our viewers, it would be essential to know that there have been only three players who won the World Cup both as a player and coach. So Beckenbauer was one of them. Mario Zagallo of Brazil was the second, and the third is Didier Deschamps, who is of France, 55 years old. He's around, and we lost Beckenbauer and Zagallo. Today, the focus of this chat is with Uli Hesse, a celebrated football writer from Germany, and he has written a book called In the Three Lives of the Kaiser. Now, before I go over to Uli, it would be also right to introduce Sandeep Mishra, who's our sports editor, who has been tracking sports for a very long time. And he has very closely read Uli's book, and he would have a lot of questions around that. Uli, first of all, a very warm welcome to you on the show.
Hello, I'm happy to be on the show. Good evening. I think it's evening where you are.
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
First of all, what a lot of viewers would want to know from you is that when we talk about Beckenbauer and how great he was now when compared to other greats like a Maradona, like a Pele, and so many other modern greats. But how do you define his greatness in footballing terms, and how does Germany see him?
Well, of course, that's a difficult question to begin with. But you just mentioned one of the things that everybody spoke about when he died, that he was one of only three players who won the World Cup, both as a player and as a manager. And I think the first thing that makes Beckenbauer stand out in terms of for Germans, is that we would say he won it a third time, namely as an administrator, an official, because we think that we were only awarded the 2006 World Cup as a host nation because of Beckenbauer's work as an ambassador. And this reputation has been tarnished a bit. Maybe we'll talk about this later, but this is one of the things that really makes him stand out for us as a nation, because that World Cup was very important to us. And the other thing, from a purely footballing point of view, is that you could make a point of saying that Beckenbauer was the only player in history who invented his own position on the field. He was known as probably the biggest libero who ever lived, sweeper. His interpretation of the role was very, very unusual. So these two things are, well, certainly things that make him stand out and make him put him apart from everybody else.
I've been reading some extracts about Beckenbauer, both as a player, as a leader, and then later as an administrator. And there's a lot of praise about him as a mentor. Now, that is rare because a lot of the modern players don't seem to want to mentor anyone, or they are pretty selfish on that count. But that doesn't seem to have applied to the Kaiser.
No, I think it's because he was so many things, Some people were influenced him by as a player, just the way he played the game. Others were influenced by him as a manager, because the way he was not one of the great tacticians to ever grace a coaching bench, but he just had charisma. And then let's not forget all the roles he had after being a player and a manager. He was Bayern Munich's president. He was the German FA's vice president. He was on the FIFA executive committee and all these things. So there was just so many things where he wielded influence.
As an administrator later on in his life, he got enmeshed in a couple of so-called alleged corruption scandals that seems to have tainted his legacy. According to you, was he able to clear his name? And how does Germany in particular see him or judge him on that count?
Yeah, this is a very good question, because, on the day the day after he died, because the news broke only on the following day, this was really one of the main things. Nobody doubted that our greatest ever player had passed away. Nobody doubted that one of the greatest players in football history had passed away. When he was playing, probably only Pelé and Johan Cruyff were amongst the equals. But there was always this question, do we bring up these corruption things now? And my point is that we should bring them up because they had an influence, whether they were right or wrong, whether he cleared his name or not, it had an influence on his later life. And, my book is called The Three Lives. Most people assume it's called The Three Lives of the Kaiser because it's about the player, the manager, and the administrator. But that's not quite true. It's called The Three Lives of the Kaiser because of the way people looked at him in Germany, changed a lot over the years. And his third life was really after those allegations broke in 2014. Because from that point on, it was most normal people, regular fans, they just said, come on, he just got drawn into this FIFA quagmire and everybody is corrupt there. And what could he do? But it was the journalists and the writers, who were very critical. So that's, I won't go as far as saying that killed him, but it was a major blow for him. And he felt treated badly. And this certainly played a role in with all, the health issues he had in the last years of his life.
Before I toss to Sandeep, there is one other point I would like to come to you, Uli, and which is, again, one read quite a bit about the fact that he was so un-German that he never believed in the hard toil, blood, sweat, tears kind of training. He was so naturally brilliant and so many other things. How did that fit in? Was he allowed to remain un-German, or is it an unkind sort of description?
No, this is very good, because this is actually the first life that he led in my book. When he was a player, it was the other way around, compared to the bribe allegations, because in his first life, all the writers and reporters were just, they just loved him, because he was so good. He was clearly the best player. Whereas the normal fans, they admired him and they respected him, but they didn't really love him. And one of the reasons for that, there were many reasons, but one was that he was so un-German. Everything seemed to come easy to him. And there are countries where this is probably admired. I don't know. We think of the French or the Italians, and they value grace, and But for Germans, it's more like we like people to see people sweat and work hard. And Beckenbauer himself was very aware of that. In his first autobiography, he devoted 2 pages to that there are German players whom the public loved, but he wasn't one of them, simply because he was not like the man on the street.
So that's a prize for brilliance. Sandeep, over to you.
Well, just coming back to the book, once you go through the pages, you go through the chapters, and you have had references to the other biographies that have been written about him. But when you decided on your own, this one, The Three Lives of the Kaiser, was it something that you really needed to think that you need to divide it into 3? Or was it difficult to just go with something like, this is the story of Franz Beckenbauer? Was it that, or was it a very conscious decision to divide it?
Well, it was actually the first thing that came to my mind, or at least the second, because it was a combination of 2 things. I mentioned in the prologue that I was on a panel of football writers in Dublin, and I was asked how people perceived Beckenbauer. That was just shortly before the allegations broke, and I thought about this, and I realized that we never perceived him in one way. Well, when I say we, I mean German, of course. In his home country, he was never perceived the same way. It was always an up and down, and I thought that was quite interesting. And I began to think about it, and then somebody mentioned to me that there was no book on Beckenbauer in English, which is quite surprising, because he became world famous in England during the 1966 World Cup, and he later played in the USA. And he was one of the really greats in the 60s and 70s. And the British have books about all kinds of players, of all the greats, of course, but also, I don't know, There's a book about Ferenc Puskás, the Hungarian player, but there was no book on
Yeah.
Beckenbauer. And I thought this was very strange. So, so I thought I should rectify that.
But I mean, as a football fan, as a reader, I was also looking forward to a little bit more. Let's say the young Beckenbauer in the '66 World Cup, and then in the '70s, when 1970 World Cup, when he actually matures, and you have that great match against Italy, and then '74 was the crowning moment. But any particular reason why you probably didn't enlarge on them in terms of the matches, in terms of what was happening inside them? Beckenbauer's personality, character, any reason?
I also, it's also very, very interesting. I mean, from a purely footballing point of view, his career is very, very interesting, and I don't think there's been a career like it, because he was obviously a very talented player from a young age. Like all very talented players, he was playing up front. And he was scoring goals. I mean, that's what we all like. We all dream of being like, we all want to be Ronaldo and Messi. We don't want to be the central defender. But he gradually moved backwards, from the wings into midfield, then into what we would today call a holding midfielder. And then, well, almost as far back as he could, because back then the sweeper was playing right in front of the goalkeeper. And so that was very interesting. And I must say that it was only during the research of the book that I realized how much of a controversy that was, for coaches who had to play the best player at the back, which is a very unusual decision to make. For the player himself to decide that, I could be playing up front and scoring goals, but maybe I'm more useful at the back. And of course, for the public who didn't quite know what to make of it. I don't know if you want to talk about it later, but what I didn't really know, because I'm too young, until I researched the book, was that there were all these accusations flying towards Beckenbauer from the readers' pages of the sports magazines, when he basically said, I would like to play sweeper for Germany as well, not just for Bayern Munich. And people accused him of, taking it easy, because you don't have to run at the back, you're just afraid of, football was a tougher game in the 70s. It could be very, very brutal. So people were saying, you're just afraid of, all those tackles in midfield, and, you're yellow. And they were actually thinking that, which for us seems silly, now knowing that he was, one of the greatest, well, he was probably in his position the greatest player ever. But back then it was a big topic. So that was also a very interesting thing. That's in a way, that's alive within one of those three lives, moving from the front to the back.
There's a very interesting line in the book. If the very same guy who stops an attack starts one, you have struck gold.
Yeah.
I mean, does this line in a way showcase Beckenbauer? Does it also put a period to football where everything changed from that end?
Yeah, you have to remember that back then, everything was very defined on the football field. So defenders were defenders and midfielders were midfielders. And I think probably the most revolutionary thing about Beckenbauer was that he was basically playing all over the field. Which is also why, you could say that he, as a single player, defined how his club and later his country had to play the game. Because if you have a central defender moving forward all the time, of course, everything has to be constructed around him, because, somebody has to cover his back, somebody has to take up his role. So there's all these kinds of things that come into play for a coach. But I was going to say that things were very defined, and it was not a defender's job to be creative. The defender gave the ball to the midfielders. Then there was also the thing that Beckenbauer himself later, it was another quote coming from him, which was quoted quite often in the last couple of days, was that he had an advantage because he had a tactical advantage, because back then there was man marking, of course. So every player was, assigned another player. You just mark him, and of course, if the guy who's actually the secret playmaker, is playing so deep, of course you don't mark him. There's no point in following to the other end of the pitch. But which also means that if Beckenbauer took the ball and moved forward, there was nobody really who felt responsible for him. So it immediately threw the other team into confusion. So, and he must have realized this very early on, but it took a while for coaches to realize this. It was probably the first was Tchaikovsky, his coach at Bayern Munich, a very, very offense-minded coach. He was one of those coaches who actually preferred to winning 5-4 than 1-0. Just because he was that kind of coach. But so it was very, very surprising that he, of all people, decided to move one of his most attacking players, actually one of his most creative and dangerous players, so far back. But that's why I used this line, because Tchaikovsky clearly realized that if Beckenbauer could stop an attack and then also, instigate the counterattack, this was unheard of at the time, and this, of course, made him stand out and help Bayern Munich immensely.
But just to take on that point of marking, I think somewhere in the book, when we have that 66th chapter, when you're writing about that, and then you say that maybe if the marking, if he wouldn't have been just being separated from the team to mark Charlton, then probably they could have been a different result in the final. I think. Do you still agree? Do you still agree with that? I mean, that what you've written there.
Yeah, this is one of the great, both in England and in Germany. This is one of the great talking points about Helmut Schön, the national manager's decision before the game to have Beckenbauer man mark Bobby Charlton. At that time, Beckenbauer was still playing in midfield. He was not the sweeper. He was a defensive midfielder. So it was not totally unusual for him to do that. So it would have been one of his duties. And I think Beckenbauer himself later said because a lot of people accused Helmut Schön after the game. They told him, Beckenbauer should have been free to roam, or he should have been more attacking, But Beckenbauer himself later said that, well, I did take him out of the game in a way, because neither Beckenbauer nor Charlton were really the stars of the game.
Yeah.
So he did his job, and Germany were quite unlucky to lose, So you can say it was really Helmut Schön's fault. But it's also true that it would have been a very different game, if Beckenbauer had not marked Charlton there.
But an area, I don't know, an area that really set me thinking was where you bring in AC Milan that wants Beckenbauer to come over. And Beckenbauer says that, there were 100,000 people there watching a football game, and he really wanted to go, but Bayern didn't release him at that time. Let's just say, imagine that he had gone there. Do you think that trajectory, that path, that entire career of France would have been very different to what we saw later on?
Of course, this is a hypothetical question.
Yeah, I know.
You would have to say yes, of course, because there was a very moving scene yesterday evening, because Bayern played against Hoffenheim yesterday evening, and it was all about Beckenbauer, of course. And Sepp Maier was there, the goalkeeper, the former Bayern Munich goalkeeper. And they said, do you think we should rename the ground the Franz Beckenbauer Arena instead of the Allianz Arena? Or what should we do? And he said, Franz wouldn't want that, He was really, at heart, he was really modest and a simple person. He wasn't for all this hullabaloo. And then Maier said, but the one thing they should do is, there's a bronze statue of Gerd Müller. And they should put a Beckenbauer statue next to it. And then he said, and when it's my turn, they should put a statue there, because this would be the axis, the reconstruction of the axis. And what he meant by that was this famous Bayern Munich, triumvirate, or axis as they call it,
True.
the goalkeeper, the sweeper, and the central striker.
The forward.
And he said that was really the secret of the club's success and also of the national team's success. So if you take Beckenbauer out of there, or for that matter, Gerd Müller, Rosep Meyer,
True. Oh, yeah.
there is at least a very high probability that Bayern Munich wouldn't have become this, this dynasty, this global super club which they became.
Or maybe even Beckenbauer, if he wouldn't have been, or maybe if he wouldn't have joined at that particular time, do you really think Bayern would have been Bayern today?
Well, probably not. No, probably not. It's football. Then again, football is so many. I think football is so beloved by so many people around the world because there's still this element of chance. It's a very, very low scoring game. So one mistake, one dodgy refereeing decision or whatever can change a game and can change a lot of things after that, which I've also written a book about Bayern Munich, the club. And I open it with what I think and what many people think is maybe the key moment in the club's history. And that is the first European Cup final against Atletico Madrid in 1974. In the first game, it was replayed because Bayern were down 1-0 going into the last minute of extra time. And Georg Schwarzenberg, who was, ironically, Franz Beckenbauer's deputy, he was the player who would always slot into the defensive role when Beckenbauer moves forward, where he tied the game in the last minute with a long range shot. It was a very unlikely goal and a very unlikely goal scorer. And nobody knows what would have happened if Bayern had not won that game, because at that time they weren't doing well in the Bundesliga. But they won the cup, they qualified for the next season as the cup holders, they won it again, and so on and so on. So, of course, if you take a total giant like Beckenbauer out of the equation, then the club's history would have been very, very different. But sometimes, it's also the very little things and the unheralded players. It's football is unpredictable.
Even I never read about a coach calling Gerd Müller a weightlifter. That was such a fascinating line. I just couldn't imagine anyone calling Gerd Müller a weightlifter.
Yeah, he had this huge thighs, and it was. This was actually some people tried to explain why he was scoring all these goals. Just the other day, my old friend Paul Simpson. I wrote a couple of books together with him. He used to edit for 2 magazine. He was doing a piece about Harry Kane, and he said his question was that the English have this myth of the central striker, the center forward, tall, strong, heading all these goals, and he wanted to know if Germans also have this myth of what a central striker should be like and what is the perfect center forward. And I said, I think we used to have this until Gerd Müller came along. Because he was none of those things, he was rather small, he was actually, one of his coaches called him, fatty, which he wasn't, of course, but he looked a bit stocky. But of course, he still kept scoring all those goals. And people wondered, why does he how can he do this? And one of the reasons people came up with was his low center of gravity, which allowed him to turn very quickly. And of course, his huge size would have played a role there. So maybe that's why. This.
But such a huge player. I mean, such a champion, such a great coach. Anything that you probably think that makes Beckenbauer say that the time that he spent with Cosmos was probably the best of his footballing life? I mean, why did France probably even think like saying that when he's had such a glorified career in Germany itself?
I'm not sure if it was the footballing career, but yeah, probably included the football. At least in the way that I structured the book, sorry, his first life ends in 1977 when he moves to the Cosmos. And it's not just that he moves to the Cosmos. He was under a lot of pressure at the time. as I've hinted at, he was not really beloved by the German public. Admired, yes, but not beloved. Also because he played for Bayern Munich. Then there were all kinds of things. He was estranged from his wife. He had tax problems. So leaving Germany was a bit like, running away. There was a famous headline in one of the major German papers called "Sweeper on the Run" when he left Germany. Because everybody wondered why. I mean, everybody would have said, "Why don't you go in late '78 after the World Cup in Argentina? Why in '77? You're still young enough to play a World Cup." So a lot of people felt like he was running away, and in a way he was. He just likes. I think in my book I say that he did what everybody has done historically who goes to America, because he reinvented himself and he found a new life. And I think it was very, very refreshing for him to be just somebody in New York City. I mean, he was not nobbing with Mick Jagger, and he was going to Studio 54 and other stars, and he was a star, of course, but he was not as huge as in Germany. So he could walk down the street and probably nobody, would bother him. There was one thing. The other thing was also, I think, that he kind of liked that it was football, yes, and he was earning good money and it was important, but there was not this pressure, which had always been on everybody at Bayern Munich. I mean, this whole NSDL thing, the American Soccer League, it was all about showboating, and glamour and having fun, and drawing people to the ground. So there was also a lot less pressure. Then, of course, playing with Pelé was a dream come true for him, because he'd always admired Pelé. And then finally, I think, although he had been traveling a lot, of course, like every sportsman has, he just became a man of the world in New York, much more. He was much more debonair and world-wise after he came back from New York.
The Americanization of Beckenbauer, would you call it that?
In a way, yes, maybe. He still spoke with a very, very strong German accent. Yeah, but I spoke to the woman he went to America, his girlfriend at the time, and she loved America, she loved New York, but he said, well, she took his kids to baseball games, and they always fell asleep. But she said the kids, the boys, they all became fans of American sports, not necessarily baseball, but they became American football and basketball fans. So in a way, yes, there was some kind of Americanization of the Beckenbauer family.
You haven't really elaborated on his son, the under-17 coach for Bayern, but you've given us enough in a way that his death probably was like a huge blow to France, in that sense. So was that something that really, really brought him down?
Yeah, I haven't elaborated on him in the sense that I've not really delved long into his own life, but he is one of the figures who constantly come up in the book.
Yeah.
Because, first of all, like all famous people, one of the biggest regrets in Beckenbauer's later life was that he was never there for his kids as a father. I quote some actually very bitter lines from his son, who says that when he became a player, his dad maybe watched him only 3 or 4 times. And he wasn't really there for him as a father. But of course he couldn't be, he was traveling all the time. The other thing is that, of course, Beckenbauer also cast such a long shadow. Quite obviously, in a way that after he retired, West Germany suffered for years and years and years because they tried to find another sweeper. Germany for a long time, they just we stuck to this one system of playing football, whereas everybody else had moved on. Everybody else played with the flat back 4. But Germany needed to play with a sweeper. But the point is that you have to have a really good sweeper. But he was the greatest. So there wasn't, it was, so his shadow was really too long, but also for his son, his son became a footballer, but he was always the son of Franz Beckenbauer. So how do you live that down? And then, of course, I mean, yeah, that's an element of tragedy, but it's also, it's quite important for Beckenbauer that, he had this incredibly blessed life. And he himself would be the first to tell you that, he was the luckiest man on the face of the earth for decades and decades and decades. And then in his last years, the blows just kept coming very hard. His one of his best friends died, who was also his personal manager. And then, of course, his son is diagnosed with an incurable brain tumor. And that is, this is just such a grief, personal loss, such a tragedy. This really, and this came on the heels of all those bribe allegations, which is, I also make the point in the book that for a long time, people wondered, why doesn't he stand up and clear his name? Why doesn't he say what happened? Why is he always saying that I did nothing wrong? That's all I have to say. But it took a while. It was only later that we realized that was just around the time that he learned that his son was going to die. So there were certainly other things on his mind. And as I say that, all this contributed, of course. Not of course, but I think it contributed to his many health issues in the last years of his life.
I mean, bringing in Diego Maradona here, personal lives. When you read Jimmy Burns' book also, I think you must have read Jimmy Burns, and even later on a couple of more on Maradona, they have gone into that area, that territory where they are kind of describing the affairs, the other women apart from, his wives and girlfriends. Is that something that you thought that maybe I'll put it in bits and parts, but I don't want to go too much into it? Because honestly, a lot of readers out there, and especially me with whatever I have read about football, about Beckenbauer, I actually never knew that, that right from 18 or 19, he already had a child. And then the other thing, though, of course, I could never figure out how many children he eventually had, except for a part in the book where you say that, okay, he had one daughter. But was that intentional, or was it very difficult to keep it out?
No, it's quite well known in Germany. So, I mean, the fact that he fathered a child with a club secretary during the club's Christmas party is one of the is of course very, very famous in Germany, especially because he was still married at the time. And when he was asked about it, he just said that, God is happy about every child that is brought into the world. So his relationship with women is very well documented in Germany, but and I do mention them all, of course, and they all make an appearance. And like I said, Diana Sandmann, the photographer, he went with her to New York. She's quoted at length in the book. But of course, in contrast to most other famous football players, most notably probably people like George Best, Beckenbauer loved women, but he very rarely loved, his wives and girlfriends. They weren't models or actresses or, I don't know, clothes designers. They were just normal girls. I mean, so it was not as if I would mention the name of a famous Beckenbauer girlfriend, you would know her. People outside of Germany just don't know these women. They're not. They're just not, famous former Miss Worlds, like in the case of George Best. So, which I've always found very telling about Beckenbauer, that his wives were just regular girls, normal girls, just like he, in a way, was just a regular guy who happened to be very good at football.
Right.
So, at the end, I mean, how will Germany probably in the next decade, the next couple of decades, when actually a player is laid bare, a lot of the next generation wants to understand him, know him. How is that part of Germany going to remember Beckenbauer?
This is a good question. He will certainly be remembered as our greatest player ever. He will also be remembered as one of the managers who won the World Cup. Even we, Germany, don't have that many managers who won the World Cup. We won a couple of times, but he's one of the things that they said at the very beginning that's sometimes hard. Well, maybe it's not hard to understand, but the 2006 World Cup was really a watershed moment for Germans. Because the tournament was a huge success, and it triggered a huge football boom in Germany. And it's also, at least we sometimes like to think this, was the moment when people outside of Germany came to realize that we're no longer the country we used to be like 20, 30, 40 years earlier, that we had moved on and become a modern country. And at least very, very many people came to Germany for that tournament and came back and saying the Germans are not at all what I thought they would be like. They're very different. This tournament is still very much associated with Beckenbauer. Yes, there have been these allegations later on, but it's also worth remembering, and I think that sometimes this is not quite pointed out quite right. He was never accused of having taken any money personally. So nobody ever accused him of having taken a bribe. The question was that he led the organizing committee, and a former Adidas CEO gave them a lot of money, which then disappeared. And people think that it may have been used by somebody to bribe FIFA executives. I'm sorry, but nobody ever said that Beckenbauer had taken any money himself. So I think that in 10, 15 years' time, he will also be remembered as the man who brought that World Cup to Germany, and then who in a way defined it, because he made a point of going to as many games as he could. And, flying all around the country in a helicopter and moving from one town to the next and shaking hands and saying hi. And I've just mentioned Sepp Maier, who also said yesterday evening, again, I'm saying this because this was also one of the first things that came to Sepp Maier's mind when they asked him about Beckenbauer's legacy. And he said that, ahead of this World Cup, the weather was just terrible. It was cold, it was freezing, it was raining. And then on the day the World Cup starts, the sun comes out. And the reporter, he was trying to be funny, he said, yes, he even, he could even rule the weather. And Sepp Maier said, yeah, of course he could. So
before you come in, I'm just tempted to ask one more question, which is Beckenbauer at his peak of his past, and it's today. Okay, let's look at it that way. He's 23, 24, 25. He's the big star for Bayern. And you have Pep in Man City, and he's just joined there. What do you think will be the transfer fees that Beckenbauer of today will get to walk into a Man City side, looking at the way football is today? I mean, what is your number there?
Tell you what, I don't think he would get on the Man City side as long as Pep Guardiola is the coach. Because Pep would say, Franz, you're quite good, but you have to do a lot more running,
And this is you're saying after Pep was Bayern coach.
Yeah, I'm joking, of course, but
I know.
Uli, before we wind up, just one last point, which is that while we've already, and you've analyzed it so well, that what made this whole combination so special, that how many players are there in this world who won a World Cup as well as a second World Cup as a coach. So there are only 3 of them. But my point is slightly different. As a coach in the modern era, you have some great names like a Mourinho or a Klopp, a Guardiola, a Ferguson, Wenger. What would be Beckenbauer's legacy as a coach? And did you feel he did enough as a coach to even want to leave a lasting impression, or he was happy with what he achieved?
This is a great question, because you mentioned all those great coaches, right, we have now. And with one exception, Mourinho. With one exception, they basically all come from Johan Cruyff. You know, I always tell people we live in a Johan Cruyff world because he was a player with a vision, a manager. He had an idea of how football should be played. And he made it work, and he influenced basically everybody, you know, through his Barcelona school of coaching. And I think Mourinho is the only one who you know, the misfit in this line, you know. He parks the bus and that's it, you know. But everybody else wants to be like, you know, has learned from Cruyff. And Beckenbauer always used to say, he was very good friend of Cruyff's, which sometimes surprises people, but they were good friends. Cruyff used to say, we know what it's like, how lonely it is at the top. That's why we're friends. And Beckenbauer always used to say, Cruyff was the better player, but I won the World Cup. I think what he also, which was in a way of saying that Cruyff was this Dutch genius and I was very pragmatic. I just won games and the World Cup. And it was also the same when he was a coach. He was not a visionary. He was a very, very pragmatic coach, which surprised a lot of people. You know, most defenders or goalkeepers who become coaches suddenly like very attacking football, you know. But Beckenbauer was always very pragmatic. He maybe the reason is that, you know, he never wanted to go into coaching. One of his famous lines was that he would never coach later in life. But he was made the coach because the country needed somebody. You know, we needed a figurehead more than we needed a coach. And this is the general impression people have of Beckenbauer, the manager, that he was more a figurehead, a leader than an actual coach, which is a bit unfair because he put in a lot of hard work. But he didn't leave a legacy as, you know, there's no Beckenbauer way of playing the game, the way there is a Cruyff way of playing it.
Uli Hesse, thank you so much for your time. And you spoke so eloquently, not only talking about the Kaiser, but the way modern football has evolved. All the very best with your book. And thank you again so much for your time.
Thank you. It was my pleasure. It was very enjoyable.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks.